"Stop digging, Rex. For God's sake, leave it," snapped Eleanor Whitfield, her voice sharp and cracking under the weight of something she couldn't name. The German shepherd ignored her, claws tearing deeper into the old cedar chest that had sat undisturbed in the corner of their farmhouse for nearly 30 years. His nails scraped wood, each sound grating like a scream in the silence of that Sunday afternoon. Eleanor's husband, Frank, leaned back in his chair with a frown, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee mug. He was a man who didn't startle easily, yet something about Rex's sudden frenzy unsettled him. The dog's growls echoed through the narrow kitchen as dust swirled in the sunlight. Finally, with a desperate whine, Rex pulled free a stiff leather-bound photo album from beneath the chest's warped lid. It fell open on the cracked linoleum floor, its plastic sleeves yellowed with time. Eleanor gasped before she even saw the photographs. Her body seemed to recognize what her mind was not yet ready to confront. She bent slowly, trembling fingers brushing the first page. Inside was a family portrait, taken decades ago. There she was, younger, with her wild auburn hair and cautious smile. Frank stood tall behind her, steady and reserved, while their son, Daniel, grinned wide at the front, his arm flung around a smaller boy. Eleanor had almost forgotten Samuel. The name came rushing back like ice water. Samuel had lived with them for a short, unspoken chapter of their lives. The child no one in town ever asked about, and the one Eleanor and Frank had promised never to mention. "Eleanor," Frank muttered, his voice hoarse. "Close it, don't." His jaw was tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the table, but she couldn't. Her eyes clung to the photograph as though reopening it pulled her into the past. She remembered the way Samuel's laughter once filled the orchard behind the farmhouse, how Daniel had looked after him with protective tenderness, and she remembered, too, the night Samuel vanished. The search parties scouring the riverbanks, the whispers that rose like wildfire through Hollow Creek until silence became the family's only refuge. Rex whined again, pawing at the next sleeve, until the photograph slipped halfway out. This one wasn't posed. It showed Samuel playing in the orchard, but behind him, faint and blurred, was another figure, one Eleanor had never seen before. A man, a stranger. He stood half in shadow, at the edge of the trees, his face obscured by the grain of the old camera film, but his presence was undeniable. Eleanor's throat tightened as if the years collapsed into a single moment. Heavy and suffocating. Frank slammed his palm on the table. Enough. The album snapped shut in Eleanor's hands, but the sound reverberated through the house like a gunshot, impossible to contain. Daniel, now grown and living down the road, would soon arrive for supper, and Eleanor knew, she could feel it in her bones, that this photograph, this discovery clawed free by the loyal dog, would drag the past into the open. She looked at Frank. His eyes were not pleading but warning. A silence stretched between them, weighted with the knowledge of all they had buried. She thought of Samuel's small shoes tucked away in the attic, the unanswered questions that had hovered over their family for decades, the neighbors who still avoided certain subjects whenever the Whitfields were near. Hollow Creek had always pretended to forget, but forgetting had never been forgiveness. Rex lay down beside the album now, his head on his paws, eyes watchful and sad. Eleanor reached for him, her hand trembling against his fur. She realized then that the dog wasn't simply scratching for curiosity. He had unearthed something meant to be seen, something that demanded reckoning. Frank stood, his voice low and final. "If you show that to anyone, Ellie will never live through it." His words struck like iron. Yet Eleanor felt, for the first time in years, a strange clarity rising in her chest. She had lived too long under the weight of silence, too long hiding from the truth that clung to that photograph. The door creaked just then. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the hallway, his cheerful voice calling out as he came closer. Eleanor pressed the photo album to her chest, her pulse racing. She knew the moment of choice had arrived, whether to shield the family one more time with silence, or to open the door to a truth that could tear Hollow Creek apart. And as Daniel stepped into the kitchen, Rex lifted his head, his amber eyes fixed on Eleanor, waiting as though he understood the reckoning was only beginning. Daniel froze in the doorway, his smile fading as soon as he saw his mother clutching the old album like it was a lifeline. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone caught somewhere between curiosity and unease. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain both men could hear it. Frank shifted first, stepping toward their son with a forced calm that felt brittle like glass under strain. "Nothing, son. Rex got into some old things, that's all. Sit down. Supper's almost ready." But Daniel's eyes didn't move from the album pressed against Eleanor's chest. He had always inherited her intuition, that quiet sensitivity to the unspoken, and it sharpened now into suspicion. Eleanor wanted to speak, to confess everything, but her mouth stayed dry. Instead, she turned the album slightly as though hiding it from view, and that motion only made Daniel's eyes darken. "That's Samuel, isn't it?" he asked suddenly, his voice steadier than hers had ever been. The name pierced the air like a blade. Eleanor flinched, the sound of it dragging up memories she had forced into silence for decades. Frank's shoulders stiffened, and his jaw worked furiously as if he could grind the word into dust with his teeth alone. "Daniel, Frank warned, his voice low, but the warning only stoked the fire. Daniel stepped closer, his face tight with a restrained anger. "I was a child, but I remember him," he said. "You never let me talk about it. Every time I asked, you shut me down. Why did you both act like he never existed?" The room, I felt smaller, walls closing in with every word. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the album despite Frank's glare. The photograph of the orchard lay there. Samuel's small frame captured mid-laugh, and behind him, the shadowed stranger watching. Daniel's breath caught. He crouched beside the table, staring at the blurred figure. "Who is that?" His voice cracked, not with fear, but with the desperate need of a son who had lived too long without answers. Eleanor searched her husband's face for support, but Frank's silence was louder than any denial. She felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't know," she whispered, though deep down the whisper carried doubt. Memories fluttered at the edges of her mind. Strange phone calls, Samuel's sudden arrival into their home, the way Frank had insisted he stay with them just for a while without explaining more. She had asked questions once, but every answer had been a stone wall, and she had learned to stop asking. Daniel's hand shook as he touched the photograph, his voice breaking. "Do you know what it was like for me? I thought I made him up. I thought I imagined him because you two refused to say his name. Do you know how crazy that makes a child feel?" His words landed heavy, filling Eleanor with guilt she could no longer smother. Rex whined softly in the corner, tail twitching, as though sensing the sharp edge of truth cutting into the family. Frank finally spoke, his voice harsh. "Enough, Daniel. There are things you don't understand, things that don't concern you." But Daniel snapped upright, his face flushed. "Don't concern me. He lived in my room. He was my brother in every way that mattered. And one night, he was just gone, like he'd been erased. That stranger in the photo, did he take him? Did he know something? Did you let it happen?" The accusation split the air wide open. Eleanor gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks as the words burrowed deep into her conscience. Frank's face hardened into stone, but his silence was its own confession. Daniel's chest heaved, fury and grief colliding in his voice. "I deserve to know the truth. If you won't tell me, I'll find out myself. I'll show this picture to the sheriff, to the whole town, if I have to." Eleanor reached for her son's arm, her voice trembling. "Daniel, please, if you bring this out, if you stir this up, it will destroy everything. The town, our family." But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. Everything had already cracked long ago. They were just standing on the fractures. Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain she had never seen in him before. "It already destroyed everything, Mom. You just chose not to look at the pieces." The silence that followed was unbearable. Eleanor felt something inside her snap, years of repression and fear breaking loose. She held the album out to Daniel, ignoring Frank's furious glare. "Then take it," she whispered. "If you can find answers, find them. I can't carry this anymore." Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the album. Rex shifted, placing his paw gently on the edge of the book, as if urging the choice forward. And in that tense, fragile moment, Eleanor realized the past had finally clawed its way back into their lives. The truth, whatever it was, would no longer stay buried. Outside, the fading sun slipped behind the trees, casting long shadows into the kitchen. With them came the unshakable certainty that whatever Daniel uncovered would not just alter their family, but shatter the fragile piece of Hollow Creek forever. The storm outside had quieted to a drizzle, but inside the Whitfield farmhouse, the storm had only begun. Daniel stood by the kitchen doorway, his easy smile faltering as he saw his mother clutching the old leather-bound album against her chest. His gaze shifted from Eleanor's pale face to his father's rigid posture, then to Rex lying alert on the floor, ears pricked, watching every movement as if he too knew that the air had thickened with secrets. Daniel's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" His voice was careful, steady, though beneath it lingered a suspicion born from years of noticing shadows in conversations that should have been ordinary. Eleanor's lips parted, but before she could speak, Frank cut across the silence with authority sharpened by fear. "Nothing you need to worry about. Sit down, son. Dinner's almost ready." His words landed flat, brittle, like glass about to crack. Daniel didn't move, his eyes fixed on the album in Eleanor's hands, the corners of which protruded as though the photographs inside strained to escape Mom. Daniel pressed gently but insistently. Eleanor's throat tightened. She could feel the tremor in her fingers, the pounding in her chest. She had hidden this truth for decades, buried it so deep she convinced herself it was gone. Yet here it was, unearthed not by her will but by a dog's restless paws. She felt Samuel's name rise like a whisper against her lips, and she tasted both salt and sorrow. Frank's voice deepened. "Leave it." He stepped closer, his hand outstretched to take the album, but Eleanor turned slightly away, clutching it tighter. The act was small but defiant, and in that moment Frank's expression shifted, not anger, but a dread so profound it seemed to hollow his eyes. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had grown into a man respected in Hollow Creek, a teacher at the small school, a figure who carried kindness like armor. But he had never shaken the faint outline of someone missing from his childhood, a blurred absence in the background of every memory. He didn't know Samuel's name, but he had felt him. In empty chairs at the table, in silences after certain questions, in the way his parents' eyes sometimes darkened without explanation. And now, standing there, he realized the silence had never been empty. It had always been hiding. Who is he? Daniel's voice was low, demanding but heavy with pain. The boy in the photo. Eleanor's eyes filled, her vision swimming, as she opened the album. The photograph lay there, untouched by time except for the yellowing edges. Samuel's face, small and radiant with joy, stared back at them, and beside him Daniel's own boyish grin. But in the far corner of the orchard, blurred and ominous, was that stranger shadow of menace captured in stillness. Eleanor's voice cracked as she spoke. His name was Samuel. He was your brother. The words dropped like stones into the room, reverberating in the silence that followed. Daniel staggered back, gripping the edge of the table. Brother. The words split something open in him, flooding him with fragments of memory that suddenly made sense. The nights he thought he dreamed of another child's laughter, the toy car that was never his, the extra stocking that appeared once then never again. Frank's face hardened. That's enough, Ellie. His tone was both a warning and a plea. But Eleanor could no longer retreat. She felt the years pressing against her, every lie, every quiet nod when neighbors asked about family. She turned to Daniel, her voice trembling but steady. We took him in when you were 5. He wasn't ours by blood, but we loved him like he was, until the night he disappeared. Her words faltered as tears spilled freely now. We searched, God knows we searched, but all we found was that photograph, and the man in it. Daniel's chest heaved as if the air itself refused to settle. A man, who was he? Did he take him? The questions tumbled out, desperate, raw. Eleanor shook her head, helpless. We never knew. The sheriff said it was too blurred, too vague. They told us to let it rest, to bury the memory. But how do you bury a child? Her voice broke and she covered her mouth with shaking hands. Frank's eyes burned with unshed tears, though his body remained unyielding. It tore us apart once before. It'll tear us apart again. Do you want that, Ellie? Do you want this town to rip into us like vultures? They'll say we failed him. They'll say we failed you. His voice cracked at the edges, betraying the depth of his own guilt. Daniel stood frozen, the ground shifting beneath him. All his life, Hollow Creek had felt like a place of stability, of roots and heritage. Yet now it was as though the soil itself was poisoned with secrets. He looked at the photograph again, at the shadowed figure in the orchard, and felt a chill seep into his bones. Rex whined softly, breaking the suffocating silence. The dog pressed his head against Eleanor's knee, as if urging her not to falter. She stroked his fur absently, her voice steadying into something resolute. We cannot keep this hidden anymore. Daniel deserves the truth. Samuel deserves it. Frank turned away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of 30 years. His silence was heavier than words. Daniel lifted the photograph, staring at Samuel's smile, then at the blurred figure lurking in the background. He felt the fracture of betrayal and the fierce pull of determination. If that man is still out there, he said, his voice cold with resolve, I'll find out who he was. Eleanor shivered, fear clawing at her heart, but also a strange relief. The truth, once buried, had clawed its way to daylight, and though it might destroy them, perhaps destruction was the only path to healing. Outside, the drizzle gave way to a hard rain, beating against the windows like an unrelenting reminder that the past was not finished with Hollow Creek. It had only begun to speak. Eleanor's hands shook as she placed the photo album on the kitchen table, though every instinct told her to hide it away again. The house felt smaller now, walls pressing inward, as Daniel's voice drifted closer from the hallway. Frank stood, rigid near the window, his back to both of them, as if distance alone might shield him from what was about to unfold. Eleanor tried to steady her breath, but the weight of that photograph, the blurred man in the orchard, clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. Daniel entered the kitchen, his familiar smile softening the edges of the moment, but his expression faltered when he saw the look on his mother's face. What's going on? He asked, setting his keys on the counter. His gaze dropped to the album, its cracked spine and dusty cover betraying its age. I haven't seen that thing in years. Eleanor swallowed hard, unable to speak. The silence stretched until Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down, eyes fixed on her. Mom. His voice was gentler this time, but there was an edge beneath it, a suspicion he couldn't quite name. Frank turned at last, his voice sharp with a command that carried more desperation than authority. It's nothing, Daniel, just old pictures. Best to leave the past where it belongs. But his words landed heavy, thick with meaning, and Daniel caught the tremor in them. He leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the table. Then why does it feel like you're both hiding something? Rex shifted beside Eleanor, his tail thumping once against the floor before he went still again. His amber eyes watching the three of them as if he too understood the fragile moment teetering on the edge. Eleanor opened the album before she could second-guess herself. The portrait smiled up at them, the four of them herself, Frank, Daniel, and Samuel. Daniel's breath hitched. He stared at the photograph as though seeing a ghost. I remember him, Daniel whispered, his voice low, almost reverent. Samuel, he blinked hard. jaw tightening as old fragments stirred in his memory. You never told me what really happened. It just stopped saying his name. His gaze cut to his father, a raw demand in his eyes. Why? Frank's face hardened, but Eleanor saw the flicker of pain in his eyes before he masked it. Because some things aren't meant to be dug up, son. His voice was low, but the words trembled. Daniel reached forward, pulling the next photograph from its sleeve, the one of Samuel in the orchard. His brow furrowed as he noticed the figure in the background. Who was that? The question cracked open the room like thunder. Eleanor felt her throat close. She had no answer, no explanation, only the gnawing terror that the truth had been staring at them all these years, hidden in plain sight. Frank's hand shot out, snatching the photograph away, his voice raised for the first time. It doesn't matter, he's gone. That's all there is to it. But the outburst only deepened the silence that followed. Daniel stared at him, betrayal etched across his face, as though he had finally glimpsed the secret that had hollowed out their family. Eleanor rose slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, her eyes burning with unshed tears. It does matter, she said, her voice breaking. She turned toward Daniel, her heart pounding. We tried to bury it, but the truth has a way of clawing its way back. Rex found it because it was never truly gone. Frank's face drained of color for a moment. No one moved. Then the front porch creaked under sudden footsteps. All three froze. The sound was heavy, deliberate, too unfamiliar to be Daniel's late arrival or a neighbor's polite call. Eleanor's chest tightened as shadows shifted across the curtain window. Whoever stood outside had chosen this moment, as if drawn by the same truth that refused to stay silent. Rex growled low in his throat, body tense, his eyes locked on the door. Daniel looked between his parents, his hand inching toward the album. Mom, he whispered, what's happening? Eleanor could not answer. Her pulse thundered as the knock came slow, measured, a sound that carried both warning and inevitability. The truth was no longer just inside the album. It was standing on their doorstep. The knock lingered in the silence, echoing through every corner of the farmhouse until it seemed even the walls were listening. Eleanor's chest rose and fell as if each breath was borrowed time. Frank stood, frozen, his jaw tight, but there was no commanding voice left in him now, only the quiet terror of a man who had carried too much for too long. Daniel rose, his hand hovering near the doorknob, torn between dread and the need for answers that had haunted him since childhood. Rex pressed closer to Eleanor's side, steady and watchful, the unspoken anchor in a storm of unraveling truths. When the door finally opened, there was no stranger, no faceless shadow from the orchard photograph. It was Sheriff Collier, older now, but still wearing the same sharp eyes that had once combed the town for Samuel's traces. He stepped inside slowly, removing his hat, his voice low and deliberate. I never stopped thinking about that boy. And it seems your past hasn't stopped thinking about you. The words struck deeper than accusation. They carried the weight of unfinished grief that belonged not only to the Whitfields but to Hollow Creek itself. Eleanor's throat burned as she looked at her son. Daniel's eyes shone with a hurt that had matured into something sharper, the hunger for truth. She reached for the album and laid it before him, her hand steady now. We can't run from him anymore, she whispered. Samuel deserves to be remembered, not hidden, and so do we. For the first time, Frank's shoulders slumped, the hardness leaving him like air from a punctured vessel. He sank into the nearest chair, his eyes glassy, his silence no longer a shield but a surrender. Daniel slid the photograph closer, tracing the blurred figure in the orchard with trembling fingers. Then let's remember him the right way, he said softly, his voice breaking but resolute. Outside, the evening sun spilled across the fields, golden and quiet, as if the land itself exhaled after years of holding its breath. In that fragile light, Eleanor understood that the truth, however painful, was not there to destroy them but to set them free. And for the first time in decades, Samuel's absence felt less like a wound and more like a presence that would never fade again.